All right, so for the agenda today, talk about where is silica found, you know, all the different places that it comes from, the hazards of respirable silica, the new OSHA standard, which is not so new now, but in OSHA terms, it is new, complying with the standard, and then we'll wrap it up. All right, so what is silica? Silica is a mineral made up of one silicon atom and two oxygen atoms. Oxygen is the most abundant element in the Earth's crust, and silica is the second most abundant. So there's a couple different types of silica. We have cristobalite, tridymite, and quartz. And quartz is so common that quartz is often used to refer to crystalline silica. And sand is often used to refer to as, or sand is often used to refer to as quartz. So what we're most concerned with is crystalline silica. So where is silica found? It's found in many building materials: sand, stone, concrete, mortar, rock, tile, and brick. And it's used to make all kinds of different things, but primarily glass, pottery, ceramics, bricks, and artificial stone. So the hazards of silica. The hazard exists when activities create respirable dust. So the activities that create this are cutting, sawing, grinding, drilling, crushing, sandblasting, sawing brick, block, or concrete, drilling into concrete walls or floors, jackhammering, tuck pointing, sanding drywall, and then some demolition activities. All right, so the dangers to workers. When respirable dust is inhaled, it penetrates deep into the lungs. So the lungs they react by trying to heal themselves, which develops scar tissue, and it starts to harden up around those trapped particles. So diseases that are linked to silica dust, you have COPD, bronchitis, emphysema, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, renal disease, lung cancer, and silicosis. So silicosis, this is it is a preventable disease, but there is no cure for silicosis. So respirable crystalline silica dust particles pass through the tracheobronchial tree of the lung, and they collect in the deepest recesses of the lung. And this is called the alveolar structures. When the lungs begin healing, so like I said before, they build up the scar tissue. And the buildup of scar tissue and that hardened tissue, it ultimately leads to a reduction in the ability to take in oxygen. So there's three different types of silicosis. We have chronic silicosis. It results from 15 to 20 years of low to moderate crystalline silica exposure. Chronic silicosis causes shortness of breath and clinical signs of poor oxygen, carbon dioxide exchange in the early stages. In the late stages of chronic silicosis, sufferers will experience extreme shortness of breath and fatigue, as well as chest pain and respiratory failure. So a lot of times, somebody that has advanced or chronic silicosis, they may just be sitting in a chair, not even doing anything, and they just, it's like they've been running a mile. Accelerated silicosis. So this results from 5 to 10 years of high exposure. This results in a severe shortness of breath, weight loss, just becoming weak. It's just, you're very, very sick when you have an accelerated silicosis. And acute silicosis, this is the most dangerous form of silicosis, and it also will cause a shortness of breath, weakness, and weight loss. Acute silicosis arises anywhere from a few months to 2 years after exposure to extremely high concentration of crystalline silica dust. It can be fatal, but we're talking if somebody is tunneling through the earth and they are just breathing in a ton of silica dust. So typically it's a little bit more rare, the acute silicosis. And one of the problems with chronic silicosis is you don't realize that you are getting this disease as you're working. It's kind of a slow killer, and it really doesn't show up until later in life. The acute silicosis, it shows up pretty quick. All right, so the new OSHA silica standard. So the standard 29 CFR 1926.1153 requires employers to limit workers' exposure to respirable crystalline silica and to take other steps to protect workers. Employers can either use a control method laid out in Table 1, which we'll talk about later, or they can measure workers' exposure to silica and independently decide which dust controls work best to limit the exposures in their workplaces to the permissible exposure limit, which is, well, you'll hear the PEL. That's your how much silica dust you are allowed to breathe in for over an 8-hour time-weighted shift. All right, so the old PEL versus the new PEL. At the very top, you'll see on the second line, at 100% silica, the PEL would be 238 micrograms per cubic meter of air, and the new PEL is 50 micrograms. So there's a big difference. You have, it's about 4.76 times less the amount that it used to be. So this is taking a little bit of a closer look. The pre-2016 chart is on the left, and the new PELs on the right. You can see it's very hard to, when we're talking about micrograms per cubic meter of air, it's very hard to visualize that. So this kind of shows you the difference in the PELs from pre-2016 and what we're dealing with now. All right, so some employer requirements. You've got to determine the amount of silica that workers are exposed to, or they may reasonably expect it to be at or above the action level of 25 micrograms of silica per cubic meter of air, averaged over that 8-hour day. Employers are required to protect workers from respirable crystalline silica exposures above the permissible exposure limit. And you also are required to limit access to areas where workers could be exposed above the PEL. A couple additional requirements. You're supposed to use dust controls and safer work methods to protect workers from the silica exposures. Provide respirators to workers when dust controls and safer work methods cannot limit the exposures to the PEL. And establish and implement a written exposure control plan that identifies tasks that involve exposure and methods used to protect workers. So we're going to talk about this a little bit more in detail. But first, when we're trying to comply with the standard, this is your hierarchy of controls. And a lot of people think that putting on a respirator is the first thing that you should do, but really you want to start at the top. Are you able to eliminate the hazard completely so that you don't have to go any further down the tree? Most of the time with silica, you cannot. Can you substitute the hazard? So can you use a different form of mortar or a different form of sand that does not have high concentrations of silica? If you can't do those two, you have to go to your engineering controls, which we'll talk about, administrative controls, and then your last resort, and it's considered the least effective, is your PPE. So engineering controls. The most common include wet methods and local exhaust. Wet methods involve applying water or foam at the point of dust generation to keep dust from getting into the air. So an example is a grinder that delivers water at the point of contact, a saw that has water right on top of the blade to keep that dust from being formed. Local exhaust ventilation removes dust by capturing it or near the point of where it is created. So an example is an exhaust hood that captures dust at the point where it's created. Isolation separates employees from the dust source by containing the dust or isolating the employees. So you can either have an isolation, you can either isolate the piece of machinery to keep the dust inside, or you can just isolate your employee in a booth. So those are more of fixed type controls. Work practice controls. So it involves performing a task in a way that reduces the likelihood or levels of exposure. One example is worker rotation. So you spread the exposure during the shift to several workers so that you don't just have one worker that has a heavy exposure the entire time. So you're kind of spreading that around instead of just giving it, a full, or an employee being exposed to that their whole entire shift. Scheduling work so that tasks that involve high exposures are performed when no other employees are in the area. So if you have somebody that's doing a lot of drilling, you can bring them in towards the end of the day, or you can bring them in early when there's not a whole lot of people around. And housekeeping. So limiting dust exposure when cleaning. We can no longer dry, sweep, and recreate that dust clouds. What you're supposed to be using is, wet sweeping or HEPA filtered vacuums. When I say, I don't want to say shop vacs, because you can't just use a shop vac and expect all of that dust to be contained, because typically there's an exhaust, and that dust is going to escape out of that exhaust. So it's got to be a HEPA filtered vacuum. Not allow cleaning of surfaces or clothing with compressed air unless the compressed air is used together with a ventilation system that effectively captures the dust cloud, or there's no other cleaning method feasible. And also remember, when we're using compressed air to clean anything, it has to have a chip guard, and your air pressure has to be limited to 30 psi. But whenever you have silica dust on you, you don't want to just spray somebody off with air and recreate that dust cloud. The other, for housekeeping, using a chemical compound like dust down, that's also something that's very good when sweeping. So you've protected yourself during the work, but you don't want to recreate that hazard as you're cleaning up. Complying with the standard next is the written exposure plan. All employees covered by the standard must develop and implement a written exposure control plan. The written exposure control plan describes workplace exposures and ways to reduce those exposures, such as the engineering controls, your work practice controls, and then how you're going to keep up with your housekeeping. So the plan must include the description of the task exposing workers to crystalline silica, controls used to limit the exposure. It may describe signs that controls are not working, so increase in visible dust or no water being delivered during the tool operation. So these are hazards that could come up. And the plan must include the housekeeping method used to limit the exposure. So this is an example of a written exposure control plan. And as you can see, you've got your the person completing the plan, description of the task. So stone or engineered stone slabs are cut using a gantry saw. And it gives you the task and control description. The work practice controls. So it says for tasks described above that use the wet methods controls. And then below that, we have for dry grinding and polishing, we have respiratory protection information, and then your housekeeping information at the bottom. All right, PPE. So when engineering and work practice controls cannot reduce the silica levels under the PEL, respirators must be provided. So a respirator with assigned protection factor, which is your APF, has to have at least that of a 10. It also has to have a NIOSH certified filtering face piece respirator, which is your typical dust mask that you see at Lowe's. We're not talking about a dust mask that doesn't have a filter. These have become pretty hard to find recently, but those dust masks must have an APF factor of at least 10. You also have to limit access areas that limited access areas should not allow unprotected workers, visitors, or others to enter without the proper protection. So supervisors, anybody that's coming in, sales reps, they can't enter these locations, the limited access locations, unless they are protected. And also remember that when respirators are used, you must implement a respirator program that includes fit testing and pulmonary exams, because the reason why that we want the pulmonary exams is because everybody is not fit to wear a respirator. It might become more of a hazard for them to wear them. So we need to make sure that the respirators fit them correctly, and that they are also physically able to wear a respirator. All right, so earlier we talked about Table 1, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more. So Table 1 uses a combination of engineering controls, work practices, and PPE to protect the employee. Table 1 is the preferred method of control. If you cannot comply with what is in Table 1, you are going to be required to do air monitoring and use an alternative protection. So anytime you can stay within table 1, you're a whole lot better off than having to work outside of table 1, because it just kind of opens up Pandora's box with a lot of different things, and also costly things that you're going to have to do. So we'll take a look at table 1. So this is a example of a handheld power saws. At the top, you have your equipment, and the task is being done. Then you have your engineering and work practice control methods. And then at the last 2 columns it tells you if you have to wear a respirator, and when you don't have to wear one. So the equipment task is a handheld power saw. It doesn't matter the diameter of the blade. So you have to use a saw equipped with integrated water delivery system that continuously feeds water to the blade. Operate and maintain the tool in accordance with manufacturer's instructions to minimize dust emissions. So when it's used outdoors for 4 hours or less, you don't have to wear a respirator. But if you're using it outdoors for more than 4 hours, you have to wear a respirator with a APF factor of 10. When it's used indoors or in an enclosed area, you always have to use a respirator for that. So outdoors, 4 hours or less, no respirator. Indoors, you have to always wear a respirator. So the next example is a stationary masonry saw. When you use a saw equipped with, you must use a saw equipped with an integrated water delivery system that continuously feeds water to the blade. And it also is operate in accordance with manufacturer's instructions to minimize dust emissions. You do not have to wear a respirator when you are working outside for any amount of time. And you do have to wear, it doesn't show this, but you do have to wear a respirator when you're operating this inside. Even though you have that water being applied to the cut, you still have to wear a respirator when you're working inside. So the next part with complying with the standard is you must designate a competent person. So the standard says that employers must designate a competent person to inspect job sites, materials, and equipment to implement the written exposure control plan. The competent person must be able to identify silica hazards and must be authorized to quickly eliminate or minimize those hazards. The competent person's responsibilities include identifying any situations in which bystanders could be exposed to silica and taking action to notify them. So you have to also remember when you're creating this silica dust, is the rest of the crew downwind from that? So if they are, you need to either move them to a different location or you have to protect them. Also, the competent person is also responsible for recognizing and evaluating situations where exposures may occur, evaluating the exposure potential, and making initial recommendations on how to control that exposure. So whenever a competent person is being designated, they need to have some knowledge of the hazards of silica, how you're going to control them, and they need to be able to complete. They need to be able to complete, the hazard. I'm sorry. They need to be able to complete and implement the written exposure control plan. I'm sorry. Medical surveillance. So employers must offer medical exams every 3 years at no cost to the employee for workers who are required to wear a respirator for 30 or more days per year. Why is this important? Because the exams determine if employees have a disease related to silica exposure. This allows workers to take actions to protect their health. The exams determine whether workers have any condition, such as a lung disease that is not caused by silica exposure, but that might make them more sensitive to silica exposure. In addition to this, something that I didn't mention earlier is whenever, the health of your workers is also important. And when you have smokers that are exposed to a lot of silica, that is going to accelerate their medical issues whenever they're a smoker, kind of like it does with everything else. Smoking kind of accelerates the silica, or the silicosis. And whenever you have those smokers, you need to make sure that they are definitely being protected. Training. So employers must train and inform employees covered by the silica standard about respirable crystalline silica hazards and the methods that employer uses to limit their exposures to those hazards. employers must cover the cost of training and must pay employees for their time spent in training. So this is, if you haven't done any silica training and you do have that exposure, you need to let your employees know how you're protecting them. You also need to let them know the hazards that silica can pose to them. A lot of people just don't know that drilling into concrete or cutting concrete is very hazardous to their health. And if they're doing it a lot, they need to know what those hazards are, how it can affect them, and how you're protecting them. All right, so to wrap it up, you want to use the correct tools and ensure they're working properly. When cleaning, you don't want to reactivate the hazard by creating dust clouds from dry sweeping. Anytime you see a dust cloud from when there's concrete being cut, it's probably going to contain respirable silica. Ensure that you have a written exposure control plan completed and include how you're controlling the exposure. The importance of documentation of the training provided to employees should not be overlooked. You need to get your signatures, and your employees that are exposed to silica, they need to be able to talk a little bit about what those hazards are and how they can harm them. And also, last, there are no cures for respirable silica-related injuries, but they are 100% preventable. You may have been exposing your employees for a long time to silica dust, but because this was enacted in 2016 and it was rolled out in 2017, you need to make sure you're following this rule, because there are people that are getting fined when they're having their OSHA or subcontractors on job sites that I've worked with. They have received fines, and it's very important that you're protecting these workers, because this is the newest rule for one of the newest rules for OSHA. OSHA doesn't change or implement new rules very often. So this was very, very big. It took a lot of time. There was a lot of pushback, but there was also a lot of business that knew that this was a hazard, and they're glad that OSHA has finally stepped up to try to protect workers from ultimately developing silicosis. So I'll see if we have any questions out there. My name is Michael Williams, and if you're looking for any more additional information, resources, training, you can get a hold of your producer, or you can get a hold of me directly, and my contact information is listed below. So I'll see if we have any questions. If we don't, I appreciate y'all being here, and we'll see you next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks.